Objection, Your Honor. The defense attorney's voice echoed in the quiet courtroom. All eyes turned toward Officer Daniels, who was seated on the witness stand, his brow furrowed as he responded to the heated questioning. I swear, I saw him throw the bag into the bushes, Daniels stated firmly, his voice unwavering as he gestured toward 16-year-old Marcus Johnson. The teenager sat beside his lawyer, his hands clenched tightly in his lap, his face pale but composed. The officer's words seemed to seal Marcus's fate until Marcus did something that stunned everyone. Your Honor, I have proof he's lying. Marcus's voice was steady but louder than he intended. The courtroom buzzed with murmurs, growing louder with each second. Marcus stood, trembling, and handed his lawyer a phone. The judge leaned forward. Quiet in the court. What is this about? Marcus's lawyer, Mr. Carter, unlocked the phone and played a video for the judge, visible to the jury. The recording showed Officer Daniels patrolling the same area on the night in question, searching the bushes after Marcus had already been arrested. The video captured the officer planting the bag himself before calling it into evidence. The courtroom erupted into gasps and whispers. Daniels' jaw tightened as his face flushed. Your Honor, that's not what it looks like. The judge's gavel slammed down. Enough. Court is adjourned until further notice. Marcus stared down at the floor, his heart pounding as reporters and onlookers swarmed toward the exits, their voices merging into chaos. But deep down, he knew this was far from over. Marcus didn't grow up wanting trouble, but trouble always seemed to find him. The months leading up to his arrest were the most challenging of his life. His mom, Carla, worked 2 jobs to keep their small apartment in the city, and his older brother, Terrell, had moved out, leaving Marcus as the man of the house. It all started one hot summer afternoon when Marcus and his best friend, Jaden, were shooting hoops at the local park. They didn't see the police car roll up until it was too late. Hey, you two stop right there. Officer Daniels' voice boomed across the court. The boys froze, basketball bouncing away. What's going on, officer? Jaden asked, his hands instinctively raising. Marcus did the same, his heart thumping in his chest. There's a call about some teenagers vandalizing cars nearby, Daniels replied, walking closer. You match the description. That wasn't us, Marcus said, his voice calm but defensive. We've been here the whole time. Empty your pockets, Daniels barked. The boys complied, emptying their shorts pockets onto the pavement. Marcus had a house key, a folded $5 bill, and a phone. Jaden had only his phone. Daniels didn't look satisfied. That all you've got? He asked, narrowing his eyes. Without waiting for an answer, he patted them down roughly. Stay put. The officer strode toward the bushes a few yards away, his radio crackling as he muttered something into it. Jaden glanced at Marcus, who shrugged nervously. Minutes later, Daniels returned holding a small bag of white powder. Looks like possession, he said, shaking the bag. You're both under arrest. What? Marcus exclaimed. That's not ours. You just pulled that out of the bushes. Save it for the judge, Daniels snapped, pulling out cuffs. Marcus tried to plead his case as the officer read him his rights, but it was no use. By the time they arrived at the station, his mind was spinning. He couldn't figure out how something so unfair could happen so quickly. The next day, Carla showed up at the police station, her face etched with worry. My baby ain't no criminal, she insisted to the desk clerk. After hours of waiting and filling out paperwork, Marcus was released pending trial, but the damage was already done. News of his arrest spread through the neighborhood like wildfire, and everyone had an opinion. Jaden's parents hired an expensive lawyer who managed to get the charges dropped for their son within weeks. But Marcus wasn't so lucky. Carla could barely afford the public defender assigned to his case, let alone a private attorney. It seemed like the system was stacked against him. As the court date loomed, Marcus stayed home more, avoiding the judging stares of neighbors and classmates. Jaden stopped answering his texts, and even Terrell didn't check in. The only thing that kept Marcus going was a conversation he overheard late one night. Carla was on the phone with her sister, her voice low but angry. I know my son, and he didn't do this. That cop set him up. I just don't know how to prove it. Hearing those words sparked something in Marcus. If nobody was going to believe him, he needed to find a way to prove his innocence himself. The night before his court appearance, Marcus couldn't sleep. He scrolled through his phone aimlessly until he remembered something. A group of kids had been recording TikToks at the park the day he was arrested. He searched hashtags related to the park, scrolling through dozens of videos, until finally he found one. The video wasn't focused on him or Jaden, but in the background, he could clearly see Officer Daniels searching the bushes after they were already cuffed. Marcus froze. If he could find that, maybe there was more. The next morning, Marcus asked his mom to drop him off at the park early. He wandered around, trying to find anyone who might have seen something that day. Finally, he spotted a teenager sitting near the swings, wearing the same hoodie from one of the TikToks. "Hey, you were here a few weeks ago, right?" Marcus asked nervously. The teen nodded. "Yeah. Why? Did you record anything else that day? Like, around the time the cops showed up?" The teen raised an eyebrow, but pulled out his phone. "Maybe. Let me check." After a few swipes, he found it, a video of Officer Daniels pulling the bag out of his pocket and shoving it into the bushes. Marcus's heart raced. "Can you send that to me? Please." The teen hesitated, but nodded. "Yeah, sure." Marcus didn't realize how much that video would change everything until he saw Officer Daniels lie on the stand. Watching the video play in court, showing the truth, felt like justice was within reach. But as the judge slammed the gavel and ended the session, Marcus knew that exposing the lie was just the beginning. What Daniels would do next, or what the system would try to cover up, remained unknown. The courtroom was a storm of whispers and shifting eyes as people filed out. Marcus sat frozen, replaying the moment in his head, the stunned look on Officer Daniels' face when the video played. It felt like a small victory, but Marcus could sense the tension in the air. His mom, Carla, leaned in close. "You did good, baby," she whispered, squeezing his hand. "But this isn't over." Marcus nodded, his chest tight. He wasn't sure if it was nerves or anger that made his stomach churn. As they walked out, reporters crowded them, their cameras flashing. "Marcus, how did you get the video? Do you think the officer will face consequences?" Carla shielded him, her voice sharp. "No comment. Leave him alone." They pushed through the crowd, but Marcus couldn't help overhearing someone mutter, "Another thug trying to play the victim." The words stung, but he kept walking. That night, Marcus lay awake, staring at the ceiling. The video had shifted the case in his favor, but he couldn't shake the feeling that something bad was coming. He thought about the way Officer Daniels glared at him after court was adjourned, his face a mix of panic and rage. Suddenly, Marcus's phone buzzed. He grabbed it quickly, hoping it was Jaden. Instead, it was a message from an unknown number. "Watch your back. This isn't over." His heart dropped. The text felt like a punch in the gut. Who would send that? Daniels? Someone else involved? Marcus showed the message to his mom the next morning. Carla's face darkened. "We're telling Mr. Carter. This has to be part of the case." At their lawyer's office, Mr. Carter frowned as he studied the message. "It's clearly intimidation," he said, leaning back in his chair. "But proving who sent it is another story. Can't the police trace the number?" Marcus asked. Carter let out a bitter laugh. "The same police department we're accusing of misconduct? They're not going to help us. If anything, they'll bury it." Marcus felt a wave of hopelessness, but Carter leaned forward. "Don't worry. This only makes your case stronger. It shows they're scared." In the days that followed, Marcus tried to go back to his routine, but everything felt different. At school, people stared and whispered. Some teachers treated him with pity, while others looked at him with suspicion. Jaden finally texted him back, but their conversation felt forced. "Man, I'm sorry about everything," Jaden wrote. "It's just, my parents don't want me involved anymore." "I get it," Marcus replied, but he didn't. How could his best friend abandon him when he needed him most? Marcus spent most of his time at home, scrolling through articles about wrongful convictions and police corruption. He felt like a tiny piece in a much bigger puzzle, but he didn't know how to fit it all together. A week later, the court reconvened. Officer Daniels was back on the stand, and his demeanor had shifted. He looked calmer, more composed, as though he'd been coached. "Officer Daniels," Mr. Carter began, his tone sharp, "can you explain why the video contradicts your testimony?" Daniels straightened his tie. "I can't speak to the authenticity of that video. For all we know, it could have been doctored." "That's an interesting theory," Carter said, raising an eyebrow. "But the original file has already been verified by a digital forensic expert." Daniels hesitated, his eyes darting toward the prosecutor, who stood silently. Let's move on, Carter continued. You claim you found a bag in the bushes. Can you explain why the video shows you placing it there? Daniels leaned forward, gripping the edge of the stand. That's not what happened, he said firmly. That video is misleading. I was conducting a search, and I thought I saw something suspicious. I didn't plant evidence. Carter smirked. So you're saying the video lies? I'm saying it doesn't tell the whole story. The tension in the room was thick. The jury exchanged uneasy glances, and Marcus felt his stomach twist. It was clear Daniels was doubling down, but Carter wasn't letting up. Your Honor, Carter said, addressing the judge, I'd like to request Officer Daniels' body cam footage from that day. The courtroom buzzed with murmurs. The prosecutor stood quickly. Your Honor, the footage is unavailable. The officer's camera malfunctioned. Carter tilted his head. How convenient. The judge's gavel slammed down. Enough. Continue, Mr. Carter. But before Carter could say another word, a commotion erupted at the back of the courtroom. A man in his late 20s burst through the doors, holding a laptop. I have something, he shouted, his voice desperate. I have footage from that day. Everyone turned, stunned. The bailiff moved to intercept the man, but Carter held up his hand. Wait. The judge frowned. Who is this? My name is Eric Turner, the man said breathlessly. I live near the park. My security cameras caught everything that night. Marcus's heart raced. Could this be it? Could this be the proof they needed? Approach the bench, the judge said, her tone cautious. Eric handed the laptop to the bailiff, who brought it forward. The judge glanced at the screen, her expression unreadable. Finally, she nodded. We'll take a recess to review this evidence, she said. Court is adjourned. As the gavel came down, Marcus felt a surge of hope. But as he stood to leave, he caught a glimpse of Officer Daniels, his face pale and tight. It was the look of a man backed into a corner, and Marcus couldn't shake the feeling that Daniels wasn't done fighting. The courtroom emptied quickly, leaving Marcus and his mom sitting in stunned silence. Carla turned to him, her voice low but firm. You see that man, Eric? He might have just saved you. Marcus nodded, still trying to process what had just happened. Could this new footage really be the evidence they needed to clear his name for good? Or would it be just another piece of the puzzle that Daniels and his allies could twist? Mr. Carter approached them, his expression a mix of excitement and caution. This is a big break, Marcus, he said, but we need to stay sharp. If that footage is as solid as Eric claims, it could blow this case wide open. What do you think Daniels will do? Marcus asked quietly. Carter's lips pressed into a thin line. People like him don't back down easily. Be ready for anything. The next morning, Marcus woke up to the sound of Carla yelling from the living room. He rushed out of his bedroom to find her staring at the TV, remote clutched tightly in her hand. Mom, what's going on? She pointed at the screen, where a news anchor was reporting live. Behind her, police cars surrounded Eric Turner's house, their lights flashing. Sources say Eric Turner was involved in a confrontation early this morning. Police were executing a search warrant when the situation escalated. Marcus felt his stomach drop. A search warrant? For what? They're trying to make him look dirty, Carla said, her voice shaking with anger. It's retaliation, plain and simple. The camera panned to a police officer giving a statement. Marcus recognized him immediately. It was Daniels. This morning, during the execution of a lawful warrant, we discovered several suspicious items on Mr. Turner's property, Daniels said, his voice calm and measured. We're committed to upholding the law and will investigate this matter thoroughly. Marcus clenched his fists. It was a play straight out of a bad movie script. Discredit the whistleblower, make them look guilty, and hope the evidence gets dismissed. Later that day, Marcus, Carla, and Mr. Carter met at the lawyer's office. The atmosphere was heavy. They're trying to discredit Eric, Carter said, pacing the room. It's a common tactic. If they can make him look unreliable, the footage might not even make it into evidence. But can't you prove the footage is real? Marcus asked. Isn't that enough? It should be, Carter replied, but this isn't just about facts. It's about perception. If the jury thinks Eric has something to hide, they might question everything. What do we do now? Carla asked, her voice steady but tense. We keep fighting, Carter said. Eric's footage could still be the key. I'll file a motion to ensure it gets reviewed. A week passed before court was back in session. The tension in the room was palpable as the judge called the proceedings to order. We've reviewed the new footage provided by Mr. Turner, she began. The court finds it admissible as evidence. Marcus exhaled in relief, but the judge wasn't finished. However, due to the ongoing investigation into Mr. Turner's conduct, his credibility as a witness will be taken into consideration. Daniel's lips curled into a slight smirk, and Marcus felt his blood boil. They had planted evidence against Eric, just like they had against him, and it was working. Carter stood and approached the judge. Your Honor, the footage speaks for itself. It clearly shows Officer Daniels planting the bag in question. Whether or not Mr. Turner has a spotless record is irrelevant. The prosecutor stood. Your Honor, we're not disputing the footage's validity, but the context matters. This court deserves to know the full story before drawing conclusions. The judge nodded. Proceed. The footage was played for the jury. It was clear and damning. Daniels was shown walking to the bushes, pulling the bag from his pocket, and placing it carefully before calling for backup. Gasps rippled through the courtroom, and Marcus felt a surge of hope. But then the prosecutor stood. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, she began, her tone calm but firm. While this footage is troubling, it's important to remember that it shows only one moment in time. Officer Daniels claims he found the bag during a lawful search. The defense has yet to prove otherwise. Marcus couldn't believe what he was hearing. The evidence was right there, yet they were still trying to twist it. Carter shot back. Your Honor, the prosecution is grasping at straws. The footage is clear. Officer Daniels planted evidence to frame my client. The judge frowned. Let's keep this focused. We'll allow further questioning. The day dragged on as Daniels was called back to the stand. His demeanor was calm, almost smug, as he answered the prosecutor's questions. Officer Daniels, the prosecutor began, did you plant the evidence shown in this video? Absolutely not, Daniels replied without hesitation. The video is misleading. I was conducting a thorough search and thought I saw something suspicious. So you're saying the video doesn't tell the whole story? Exactly. Carter stood for cross-examination, his tone sharp. Officer Daniels, if you were conducting a thorough search, why does the video show you pulling the bag from your pocket? Daniels hesitated, his confidence faltering for a split second. It must have been a misunderstanding. I don't recall doing that. Carter pounced. You don't recall, or you don't want to admit it. The courtroom buzzed with whispers, but the judge's gavel silenced them. Order. Mr. Carter, proceed. By the time the session ended, Marcus felt drained. The highs of seeing the footage admitted were overshadowed by the lows of Daniel's slippery testimony. As they left the courtroom, Carter turned to Marcus. This is far from over, he said grimly. Daniels isn't going down without a fight. Marcus nodded, but his thoughts were elsewhere. He couldn't shake the feeling that something big was about to happen, something that could change everything. That night, as he lay in bed, his phone buzzed again. Another unknown number. You should have stayed quiet. Now it's too late. Marcus stared at the message, his heart pounding. Whoever was behind this wasn't backing down, and neither was he. Marcus sat upright in his bed, the phone trembling in his hand as he reread the message. You should have stayed quiet. Now it's too late. His chest tightened, and his mind raced. Was it Daniels? Someone else in the department? Or just someone trying to scare him? He bolted from his room, finding Carla in the kitchen. She looked up, startled by his sudden entrance. Marcus? What's wrong? He handed her the phone. She squinted at the screen, her expression shifting from confusion to fury. They're trying to scare us, she said, her voice trembling with barely restrained anger. But they don't know us, baby. We don't scare easy. Marcus tried to nod, but the weight of the situation pressed down on him. What if they're serious, Mom? What if they try something? Carla grabbed his shoulders, forcing him to meet her gaze. We've come too far to back down now. You hear me? We're going to see this through. The next day, Marcus and Carla met with Mr. Carter to discuss the threatening message. He studied the phone carefully, frowning. This is harassment, plain and simple, Carter said. But proving who sent it is tricky, especially if they're using a burner phone. So what do we do? Carla asked. We document everything, Carter replied. Every text, every call, every interaction. If they keep this up, it only strengthens your case. But Marcus, you need to be careful. Don't go anywhere alone, and if anything feels off, call me immediately. Marcus nodded, but his stomach churned. How had standing up for the truth turned into such a dangerous game? At school, things were no better. The whispers and stares had only grown worse since the new footage came to light. Some kids openly sided with Daniels, claiming Marcus was ruining a good cop's life. Others avoided him altogether, afraid to get involved. During lunch, Marcus sat alone, picking at his food. Jaden approached hesitantly, his tray in hand. "Hey," Jaden said, sliding into the seat across from him. Marcus looked up, surprised. "You're talking to me now?" Jaden winced. "I know I've been distant. My parents." "Yeah, I get it," Marcus cut in, his tone sharp. "Your parents don't want you involved." "It's not just that," Jaden said quickly. "This whole thing, it's scary, man. You've got cops coming after you, people sending threats. I didn't know how to handle it." Marcus sighed, his anger deflating. "I didn't ask for any of this, Jaden. But I can't just let them ruin my life." Jaden nodded slowly. "You're right, and I'm sorry. If there's anything I can do, let me know." Marcus gave a small smile. "Thanks." That afternoon, Marcus walked home, his headphones in, trying to drown out his thoughts with music. He was only a block away from his apartment when he noticed a black car idling at the curb. The windows were tinted, and the engine hummed softly. Something about it made his skin crawl. He quickened his pace, glancing over his shoulder. The car didn't move at first, but as he turned the corner, it began to creep forward. Marcus's heart raced. Was he imagining things? Or was someone following him? He turned another corner and ducked into an alley, pressing himself against the wall. The car rolled by slowly, its windows still up. As soon as it passed, Marcus sprinted the rest of the way home, bursting through the door and slamming it shut. "What's wrong?" Carla asked, rushing over. "There was a car," Marcus panted, struggling to catch his breath. I think someone was following me." Carla's face hardened. "That's it. I'm calling the police." "Mummo," Marcus exclaimed. "What if it's them? What if they're the ones following me?" Carla hesitated, her expression torn. "Then we call Carter. He needs to know." The next morning, Carter arranged for Marcus and Carla to stay at a hotel under an alias. "Just until things settle down," he explained. Marcus felt a little safer, but the tension was still thick. He couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching him. 2 days later, court resumed. This time, Eric Turner was called to testify. He entered the courtroom looking tired and tense, but he held his head high. "Mr. Turner," Carter began, "can you confirm that the footage you provided is authentic and unaltered?" "Yes," Eric said firmly. "I installed the cameras myself. They record everything automatically." "And did you tamper with the footage in any way?" "No." The prosecutor stood. "Mr. Turner, is it true that you're currently under investigation for possession of illegal firearms?" Eric stiffened. "Yes, but those allegations are false. The police planned it." "Please answer the question," the prosecutor interrupted. "Are you under investigation?" "Yes," Eric said through gritted teeth. "Thank you." No further questions. Marcus's heart sank. It was exactly what Carter had warned about. The prosecutor was using the investigation to undermine Eric's credibility, and the jury was eating it up. The session ended on a tense note, but things only got worse when Marcus and Carla returned to the hotel. As they approached their room, Marcus noticed the door was slightly ajar. "Stay back," Carla whispered, pulling him behind her. She pushed the door open slowly. The room was trashed. Furniture was overturned. The bed was ripped apart, and their belongings were scattered everywhere. Marcus's stomach dropped when he saw a single word spray-painted on the wall. "Liar." Carla immediately called Carter, who arrived with hotel security. They reviewed the security footage, but the cameras conveniently hadn't recorded anything. "This isn't a coincidence," Carter said grimly. "They're sending a message. What do we do now?" Marcus asked, his voice shaking. "We don't back down," Carter said firmly. "If they're this desperate, it means we're getting close." The next day in court, Carter presented the vandalism and threats as evidence of intimidation. The judge listened but didn't seem moved. Marcus felt his hope slipping away, but then something unexpected happened. As Carter wrapped up his argument, the courtroom doors burst open. A woman strode in, clutching a folder. She looked directly at the judge. "Your Honor, I have evidence that will prove everything," she said, her voice steady but urgent. Everyone turned to stare, including Marcus. Who was this woman? And what could she possibly have that would change the game? The courtroom fell silent as the woman stepped forward, her heels clicking sharply against the floor. She looked to be in her late 30s, with sharp features and an air of authority. The judge raised an eyebrow, clearly surprised by the interruption. "Who are you, and what evidence are you referring to?" the judge asked, her tone cautious. The woman held up the folder. "My name is Detective Karen Blake. I'm with the Internal Affairs Division of the Police Department. The evidence I have concerns Officer Daniels and his history of misconduct." The room buzzed with murmurs as the judge banged her gavel. "Order in the court." Detective Blake approached the bench. Blake handed the folder to the bailiff, who brought it to the judge. The courtroom waited in tense silence as the judge skimmed through the documents. Her expression darkened. "This is highly irregular, Detective," the judge said, glancing up. "But if these documents are authentic, they could have significant bearing on this case." "Counselor, have you seen this evidence?" Carter stood, looking as stunned as everyone else. "No, Your Honor. But I'd like the opportunity to review it." The judge nodded. "Very well. Court is adjourned for the day to allow both parties to review this new evidence." After the session, Carter, Marcus, and Carla gathered in a small conference room with Detective Blake. She placed the folder on the table and opened it, revealing a stack of documents and photographs. "I've been investigating Daniels for months," Blake began. "He has a pattern of targeting young black men and framing them with false evidence. Marcus isn't the first." Carla's face twisted in anger. "And you're just now bringing this forward?" Blake sighed. "It's complicated. Internal affairs investigations take time, and Daniels has friend in high places. Every time we've gotten close to exposing him, the evidence disappears or witnesses back out." Carter flipped through the documents, his expression growing darker with each page. "This is damning. Complaints from other victims, internal memos. If we can get this admitted, it could blow the case wide open. But will the court allow it?" Marcus asked, his voice tinged with doubt. "They'll have to," Carter said firmly. "This shows a clear pattern of behavior. It supports your claim that Daniels planted the evidence." Blake leaned forward. "There's more. I have body cam footage from another officer who worked with Daniels the night Marcus was arrested. It shows Daniels instructing him to stay out of it while he handled the situation." Marcus's eyes widened. "You mean someone else knew what he was doing and didn't stop him?" Blake nodded grimly. "That's right. And if we can get that officer to testify, it'll seal the deal." The next day in court, Carter presented the new evidence to the judge. The prosecutor immediately objected, arguing that it was irrelevant and prejudicial. "Your Honor," Carter said, "this evidence shows a clear pattern of misconduct by Officer Daniels. It directly supports our claim that he planted the evidence in this case." The judge hesitated, clearly weighing her options. Finally, she nodded. "I'll allow it. But proceed carefully, Mr. Carter." Carter called Detective Blake to the stand. She testified about her investigation into Daniels, detailing his history of targeting vulnerable individuals and manipulating evidence to secure arrests. The prosecutor's cross-examination was brutal. "Detective Blake, isn't it true that you've been accused of bias against your fellow officers?" Blake remained calm. "I've faced resistance from officers who don't want corruption exposed. That's not bias, it's integrity." The prosecutor smirked. "And yet you waited until now to come forward with this evidence. Convenient timing, wouldn't you say?" "I acted as soon as I had enough evidence to make a difference," Blake replied firmly. After Blake's testimony, Carter called the other officer from the body cam footage to the stand. Officer Hernandez was young and nervous, his eyes darting around the courtroom. "Officer Hernandez," Carter began, "were you present the night Marcus Johnson was arrested?" "Yes," Hernandez replied, his voice barely above a whisper. "And did you witness Officer Daniels conducting a search?" Hernandez hesitated, glancing at Daniels, who was glaring at him from the defense table. "Why, yes. What did he say to you that night?" Hernandez swallowed hard. He told me to stay out of it. That he had everything under control." And did you see him plant the bag of drugs in the bushes? The prosecutor jumped to her feet. Objection. Leading the witness. Sustained, the judge said. Mr. Carter, rephrase your question. Carter nodded. Officer Hernandez, what did you see Officer Daniels do that night? Hernandez looked down at his hands, his voice shaking. I saw him take something out of his pocket and put it in the bushes. Gasps rippled through the courtroom, and Marcus's heart leaped. Hernandez's testimony was the breakthrough they needed. As the session ended, Marcus felt a renewed sense of hope. But that hope was short-lived. As they left the courthouse, a group of reporters surrounded them, shouting questions. Marcus, how do you feel about today's testimony? Do you think Daniels will face charges? Carla shielded Marcus as best she could, but the crowd was relentless. Suddenly, a loud crack split the air. The crowd froze as everyone turned toward the sound. A brick had shattered the window of a car parked nearby. Attached to it was a piece of paper with a chilling message, "You're next." Marcus's blood ran cold. The fight for justice wasn't over, and now it was more dangerous than ever. The sound of shattering glass lingered in Marcus's ears as the crowd erupted into chaos. Carla pulled him close, shielding him from the noise and flashing cameras. Reporters shouted questions, but their voices blurred into a cacophony. Get to the car. Mr. Carter barked, ushering them toward the parking lot. They moved quickly, heads down, as police officers began cordoning off the area. Marcus couldn't stop glancing over his shoulder, his heart pounding. The message on the brick echoed in his mind, "You're next." When they finally reached the car, Carter turned to Carla and Marcus. "This is escalating," he said grimly. "We'll report this, but you need to stay somewhere safe immediately." Later that evening, Marcus sat in a new hotel room with Carla, feeling the weight of the day pressing down on him. His mind raced with questions. Who had thrown the brick? Was it someone working with Daniels? Could they really be in danger? Carla placed a hand on his shoulder, breaking his train of thought. "You okay, baby?" He nodded, though it wasn't entirely true. I don't get it, Mom. Why are they going this far? It's not like I've done anything wrong." Carla's eyes softened, but her voice was firm. "That's exactly why they're doing it. Because you're standing up for yourself. And people like Daniels don't want to be exposed." The next morning, Carter arrived at the hotel with news. "The police are treating the brick incident as vandalism," he said, frustration evident in his voice. "They're not pursuing it as a threat." "Vandalism?" Carla repeated incredulously. "That was a threat, plain and simple." Carter nodded. "I agree, but they're not taking it seriously. That's why we need to keep pushing in court. The more evidence we present, the harder it'll be for them to ignore." "What's next?" Marcus asked. "We're calling another witness today," Carter said. "Someone who used to work with Daniels. They're willing to testify about his history of misconduct." Marcus felt a flicker of hope. "Do you think it'll be enough?" "It's a step in the right direction," Carter replied. "But be prepared. Daniels won't go down without a fight." Court resumed that afternoon, and the tension in the room was palpable. Daniels sat at the defense table, his jaw tight and his eyes fixed on Carter. Marcus avoided looking at him, focusing instead on the witness being sworn in. The witness, a retired officer named James Monroe, took the stand. He was an older man with a stern demeanor, and his voice carried the weight of experience. "Mr. Monroe," Carter began, "how long did you work with Officer Daniels?" "About 8 years," Monroe replied. "And during that time, did you observe any concerning behavior?" Monroe hesitated, glancing at Daniels, who glared at him from across the room. After a moment, Monroe straightened his shoulders. "Yes, Daniels had a habit of bending the rules." "Can you elaborate?" Carter pressed. Monroe nodded. "He targeted certain individuals, mostly young black men, and often exaggerated or fabricated evidence to justify arrests. I confronted him about it once, but he told me to mind my own business." The courtroom buzzed with whispers, and the judge called for order. Carter continued, his voice steady. "Why didn't you report him?" "I tried," Monroe said, his expression pained. "But every time I filed a complaint, it disappeared. Daniels has connections in the department. People who protect him. Do you believe he planted evidence in Marcus Johnson's case?" Monroe hesitated again, then nodded. "Based on what I've seen, yes. It fits his pattern." The prosecution objected, arguing that Monroe's testimony was speculative, but the damage was done. Monroe's words added weight to the mounting evidence against Daniels. As the session ended, Marcus felt a cautious sense of optimism. But as they left the courthouse, he noticed a black car parked nearby. It looked eerily familiar, the same one he thought had followed him days earlier. He froze, his eyes locked on the car. Carla noticed and followed his gaze. "What is it, baby?" "That car," Marcus whispered. "I've seen it before." Before Carla could respond, the car's engine roared to life, and it sped off down the street. Marcus's stomach churned. Was it just a coincidence? Or was someone watching him? That night, Marcus had trouble sleeping. He tossed and turned, his thoughts racing. The testimonies and evidence felt like steps forward, but the threats and strange occurrences loomed like a shadow over everything. Around midnight, his phone buzzed. He grabbed it quickly, hoping it was Jaden or Carter. Instead, it was another message from an unknown number. "Stay out of court tomorrow. You've been warned." Marcus stared at the screen, his hands shaking. The threats were getting bolder, and he couldn't ignore the growing sense of danger. He showed the message to Carla the next morning. Her face hardened. "Enough is enough. We're not letting them scare us. We're going to court, and we're going to win." That day in court, the tension was thicker than ever. Carter presented more evidence, building on the testimonies from Monroe and Hernandez. The prosecutor fought back hard, trying to discredit each point, but the cracks in Daniel's defense were becoming impossible to ignore. During a recess, Marcus stepped into the hallway to grab some water. As he approached the fountain, he heard a voice behind him. "Marcus." He turned to see Daniel standing a few feet away, his face a mix of anger and desperation. Marcus's heart raced, but he forced himself to stay calm. "You think you're smart, don't you?" Daniel said, his voice low and menacing. "Dragging my name through the mud, making me look like the bad guy." Marcus didn't respond, his eyes darting toward the courtroom doors. He wanted to call for help, but his voice felt trapped in his throat. Daniel stepped closer, his tone venomous. "You don't know who you're messing with, kid. If you think this ends in court, you're dead wrong." Before Marcus could react, a court officer stepped into the hallway. Daniels quickly stepped back, his expression shifting to feigned innocence. "Everything okay here?" the officer asked, glancing between them. Marcus nodded stiffly. "Yeah, everything's fine." But as he walked back into the courtroom, his heart was pounding. Daniel's words echoed in his head. "You're dead wrong." Marcus knew this fight wasn't just about the trial anymore. It was about survival. Marcus couldn't shake the encounter with Daniels as he sat in the courtroom, pretending to listen while his thoughts raced. Daniels had crossed a line, and Marcus knew it wasn't an idle threat. He glanced at Carter, wondering if he should say something. But before he could decide, the judge called the court back into session. "Mr. Carter," the judge said, "you may call your next witness." Carter stood confidently, though Marcus could see the weariness in his eyes. "Your Honor," the defense calls Officer Thomas Martinez to the stand. The name sent a ripple of murmurs through the courtroom. Martinez had worked closely with Daniels for years, but had remained silent throughout the case. His sudden appearance as a witness was unexpected. Martinez approached the stand slowly, his face pale. He took the oath and sat down, his hands fidgeting nervously. "Officer Martinez," Carter began, "how long have you worked with Officer Daniels?" "About 5 years," Martinez replied, his voice barely above a whisper. "And in that time, have you ever witnessed Officer Daniels engage in misconduct?" Daniels stiffened at the defense table, glaring at Martinez. The room held its breath as Martinez hesitated. Finally he spoke. "Yes," he said, his voice trembling. "I have." The courtroom erupted into gasps and whispers, and the judge banged her gavel. "Order! Order in the court!" Carter pressed on. "Can you elaborate, Officer Martinez? What kind of misconduct did you witness?" Martinez glanced at Daniels, who was staring daggers at him. He planted evidence. On multiple occasions. And he threatened people to keep quiet. Marcus felt a surge of vindication, but the tension in the room was palpable. Daniels leaned over to his attorney, whispering furiously. Carter continued. "Did you ever report these incidents?" "I wanted to," Martinez admitted. "But Daniels has friends in the department. People who protect him. I was afraid of what might happen to me." "And why are you speaking out now?" Carter asked. Martinez took a deep breath. Because I can't live with the guilt anymore. What happened to Marcus? It was wrong. And Daniels needs to be held accountable. The prosecutor immediately objected, arguing that Martinez's testimony was hearsay. The judge overruled the objection, allowing the testimony to stand. But as the session continued, Marcus couldn't shake the feeling that Martinez had just made himself a target. After court adjourned, Marcus, Carla, and Carter gathered in the hallway. Martinez approached them hesitantly, his face etched with worry. "Look, I just wanted to say I'm sorry," he said, his voice low. "For everything. I should have spoken up sooner." Carla nodded, her expression softening. "Thank you for doing the right thing now. It takes courage." Martinez gave a small, sad smile. "Be careful. Daniels won't go down without a fight." As Martinez walked away, Carter turned to Marcus. "We're making progress, but Daniels is cornered now. That makes him dangerous. What do you think he'll do?" Marcus asked. "Whatever he can to save himself," Carter replied grimly. "Just stay alert." That evening, back at the hotel, Marcus tried to unwind, but his nerves were frayed. Carla ordered pizza and put on a movie, hoping to distract him, but it wasn't working. Every noise outside the room made him jump. Around 10 p.m., Marcus's phone buzzed with another unknown number. He hesitated before answering. "Hello," he said cautiously. A distorted voice replied, "You think this is over? You've got no idea what's coming." Marcus's stomach dropped. "Who is this?" The line went dead. The next morning, Carter arrived with bad news. "Martinez didn't show up for work today," he said, his expression grim. "His phone is off, and no one's seen him since last night." "What do you mean?" Carla asked, alarmed. "You think something happened to him?" Carter hesitated. "I don't want to jump to conclusions, but it's suspicious. He just testified against Daniels. It's possible someone got to him." Marcus felt a chill run down his spine. "What if they come after us next?" "They won't," Carter said firmly. "I've arranged for extra security. You're safe." But Marcus wasn't so sure. The threats, the messages, the black car, they all felt too close. When court resumed that afternoon, the atmosphere was tense. Daniel seemed unusually calm, a small smirk playing on his lips. Marcus hated the sight of it. Carter began the day by addressing Martinez's absence. "Your Honor, we're concerned about the safety of our witnesses. Officer Martinez, who testified yesterday, has gone missing." The judge's brow furrowed. "Missing?" "Yes," Carter replied. "We've contacted the police, but we believe his disappearance is linked to this case." The prosecutor scoffed. "Your Honor, this is pure speculation. Officer Martinez could have simply decided not to return." After giving such damning testimony, Carter shot back. "That's unlikely." The judge looked troubled. "I'll take this into consideration, but for now, let's proceed." As the day wore on, Carter introduced more evidence, including body cam footage and internal reports from Detective Blake's investigation. The case against Daniels was growing stronger, but the threats and intimidation tactics loomed over everything. During a break, Marcus stepped outside to get some air. He leaned against a wall, trying to steady his breathing. Suddenly, he noticed the black car again, parked across the street. This time, the driver's window rolled down slightly. Marcus couldn't see who was inside, but he felt their eyes on him. He quickly turned and went back inside, his heart racing. That night, Marcus couldn't sleep. The weight of everything was too much. The trial, the threats, the disappearance of Martinez. Around midnight, his phone buzzed again. "You've been warned. Stop now, or you'll regret it." Marcus stared at the message, his pulse pounding. He showed it to Carla, who immediately called Carter. "This is escalating," Carter said over the phone. "I'll contact the authorities, but Marcus, you need to be careful. Don't go anywhere alone." "What about court tomorrow?" Marcus asked. "Do we keep going?" Carter's voice was firm. "We keep going. They want to scare you into backing down. Don't give them the satisfaction." The next day, as Marcus and Carla entered the courthouse, they were greeted by a chaotic scene. Reporters swarmed the steps, shouting questions and snapping photos. "What's going on?" Marcus asked, confused. Carter met them at the entrance, his face pale. "There was a fire at Detective Blake's office last night. All of her files on Daniels were destroyed." Marcus felt like the ground had shifted beneath him. The fight wasn't just about proving his innocence anymore. It was a battle against a system willing to destroy anyone who stood in its way. The news about the fire hit Marcus like a gut punch. Inside the courthouse, the whispers among reporters and spectators created an oppressive buzz. Marcus turned to Carter, his voice trembling. "Do you think they started the fire?" Carter's jaw tightened. "I don't think it's a coincidence." "Does that mean all the evidence she had is gone?" Carla asked, her voice laced with frustration. "Not necessarily," Carter replied. "Blake kept digital backups. The fire sets us back, but it doesn't destroy the case. Still, it's another intimidation tactic, and a dangerous one." The session began with Carter formally addressing the fire in court. "Your Honor, last night there was a suspicious fire at Detective Blake's office, destroying physical evidence related to this case. We believe this is a deliberate act of intimidation aimed at silencing key witnesses." The prosecutor stood. "Your Honor, there's no proof that the fire is connected to this trial. Let's not turn this into a conspiracy theory." The judge's stern gaze silenced the prosecutor. "Mr. Carter, do you have any evidence to support this claim?" "We're awaiting reports from the fire department," Carter said. "But the timing, paired with the ongoing threats against my client and witnesses, is highly suspicious." The judge nodded. "I'll allow you to proceed, but focus on the evidence currently before the court." The day's testimonies focused on Daniel's actions during previous arrests. Carter called 2 witnesses who described similar patterns of behavior, fabricated charges, planted evidence, and intimidation tactics to silence them. The stories painted a grim picture of a man who operated with impunity. Daniel's defense team pushed back aggressively, attempting to discredit each witness. They brought up minor inconsistencies in their stories, trying to cast doubt on their credibility. But the pattern was clear, and Marcus could see the jury taking it in. During a recess, Carter pulled Marcus and Carla aside. "We're making progress, but we need to be prepared for Daniel's side to hit back hard. He's losing control, and that makes him desperate. What can he do now?" Marcus asked. "More threats, more intimidation. Maybe even something drastic to shift focus away from him. Stay alert." That night, Marcus and Carla returned to their hotel under heightened security. 2 officers were stationed in the lobby, and Carter had arranged for a plainclothes guard to keep an eye on their floor. Despite the precautions, Marcus couldn't shake the feeling of unease. Around 2 a.m., Marcus woke to the sound of heavy footsteps outside their room. He froze, his heart pounding. The footsteps stopped just outside the door. He held his breath, straining to listen. A soft scraping sound followed, like someone trying to pick the lock. "Mom," Marcus whispered, shaking Carla awake. "Someone's at the door." Carla bolted upright, her eyes wide. She grabbed her phone and dialed Carter's number, while Marcus quietly moved toward the door. He peered through the peephole but saw nothing except the faint shadow of movement. Suddenly, the doorknob jiggled violently. Carla shouted, "Get out of here. The police are on their way." The noise stopped abruptly, followed by the sound of hurried footsteps retreating down the hallway. By the time hotel security and the police arrived, whoever had been outside the door was long gone. The officers took a statement, but Marcus could tell they weren't taking it seriously. "It could have been anyone," one officer said, shrugging. "Maybe a guest who got the wrong room." "Really?" Carla snapped. "And guests normally try to pick locks." The officer raised his hands defensively. "We'll look into it, ma'am." After they left, Marcus turned to Carter. "They're not going to do anything, are they?" Carter sighed. "No. But this isn't over. We'll keep moving forward." The next day in court, the defense team called Daniels to the stand. Marcus felt his stomach churn as Daniels confidently walked up and took his seat. His demeanor was calm, almost smug, as though he was untouchable. "Officer Daniels," his lawyer began, "can you explain the allegations against you?" "They're false," Daniels said firmly. "I've served this city with integrity for over a decade. These claims are baseless." "And what about the video evidence?" the lawyer asked. Daniels shook his head. "The video has been manipulated to make me look guilty. It's not an accurate representation of what happened." The prosecutor played to Daniels' strengths, painting him as a dedicated officer under attack by opportunists and liars. The jury seemed skeptical, but Daniels' confidence was hard to ignore. When it was Carter's turn to cross-examine, his approach was razor-sharp. Officer Daniels, can you explain why multiple witnesses, including your former colleagues, have testified to seeing you plant evidence? They're lying, Daniels said flatly. All of them? Yes. And the video that shows you placing the bag in the bushes? How do you explain that? It's misleading. I was conducting a search. Carter leaned in, his voice steely. So everyone else is lying, but you're telling the truth? Yes, Daniels replied, his tone unwavering. Carter stared at him for a moment before stepping back. No further questions. As the session ended, Marcus felt the weight of the day pressing down on him. Daniels had done everything he could to deflect blame, and while the evidence against him was strong, Marcus couldn't shake the feeling that the officer still had cards left to play. That night, Marcus sat alone in his room, scrolling through the news coverage of the trial. His phone buzzed with a notification, a message from Jaden. Hey man, you good? I heard about the fire and the threats. Just wanted to check in. Marcus smiled faintly and replied, thanks bro. It's rough, but we're holding up. As he set his phone down, it buzzed again. Another message, this time from an unknown number. Tick-tock, Marcus. Time's running out. His stomach twisted as he stared at the screen. The fight wasn't just in the courtroom anymore. It was everywhere, and it was closing in. Marcus stared at the message on his phone, his mind racing. Tick-tock, Marcus. Time's running out. His hand shook as he read it again, the threat feeling more tangible than ever. He showed the text to Carla, who immediately called Carter. This has gone too far, Carla said, her voice trembling as Carter answered. They're threatening my son again. Carter's voice was calm but tense. Save the message. I'll report it first thing in the morning. Marcus, are you okay? Marcus nodded, though his throat felt tight. Yeah, I don't know what they'll do next. We're not backing down, Carter said firmly. These threats show they're scared. That means we're getting close to the truth. The next day, as Marcus entered the courthouse, the tension in the air was palpable. Reporters swarmed outside, their cameras flashing. The story had gained national attention, and everyone was watching to see how it would end. Carter leaned down and whispered to Marcus as they walked past the crowd. Today's crucial. We're calling Detective Blake back to the stand. Her testimony and the remaining evidence could seal this. Inside, the courtroom was packed. Daniels sat at the defense table, his expression calm but his eyes hard. Marcus couldn't tell if it was confidence or desperation. Carter called Detective Blake to the stand. She walked in with a steady stride, holding her head high despite the obvious weight of the case. After being sworn in, she began recounting her investigation into Daniels, describing the patterns of misconduct and the intimidation tactics he used to silence his victims. Detective Blake, Carter said, can you confirm that the fire at your office destroyed critical evidence in this case? Yes, Blake replied, her voice steady. But I had digital backups of everything. Carter nodded. And have you faced any threats or retaliation during this investigation? Blake hesitated, then nodded. Yes, I've received multiple threats, including a note left at my home last week. The courtroom murmured, and the judge banged her gavel. Order. Carter continued. What did the note say? Blake's jaw tightened. It said, drop the case or else. And did you report this to your superiors? Yes, Blake replied. But nothing came of it. Carter turned to the jury. Detective Blake has risked everything to expose the truth about Officer Daniels. These threats are further evidence of a pattern of corruption and intimidation. The prosecutor tried to discredit Blake during cross-examination, accusing her of bias and questioning the legitimacy of her investigation. But Blake held her ground, refusing to waver under the pressure. When the session ended, Marcus felt a flicker of hope. Blake's testimony was powerful, and the jury seemed to be taking it seriously. But as they left the courtroom, Carter pulled Marcus and Carla aside. We're making progress, he said, but don't let your guard down. Daniels is cornered, and that makes him dangerous. That night, Marcus sat by the hotel window, staring out at the city lights. Carla was asleep, but he couldn't relax. Every shadow, every noise outside the room felt like a threat. His phone buzzed again, and he hesitated before picking it up. The message was another threat. This is your last warning. Stay away from court tomorrow. Marcus clenched his fists. He was tired of being scared, tired of letting these people control his life. He showed the message to Carter the next morning before court. "They're getting desperate," Carter said, his tone sharp. "But we're not backing down." The courtroom was tense as Carter prepared for his closing argument. Daniels sat stiffly, his face betraying none of the panic Marcus hoped he was feeling. The jury looked weary but focused, their expressions unreadable. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," Carter began, his voice steady, "this case is about more than one teenager and one officer. It's about accountability. It's about standing up to corruption and ensuring that those sworn to protect us are held to the highest standards." He laid out the evidence piece by piece, the video footage, the testimonies of Hernandez and Monroe, Blake's investigation, all of it pointing to Daniels' guilt. "We've shown you a pattern," Carter said, "a pattern of misconduct, intimidation, and deceit. Marcus Johnson is not the first victim of Officer Daniels' corruption, but with your help, he can be the last." The prosecutor's closing argument leaned heavily on discrediting the witnesses and casting doubt on the evidence. "Officer Daniels has served this community honorably for years," she said. "These allegations are based on the words of a few individuals with questionable motives." The jury was dismissed to deliberate, and the waiting began. Marcus and Carla sat with Carter in a quiet corner of the courthouse, the weight of the case pressing down on them. "What if they don't believe us?" Marcus asked quietly. "They will," Carter said, though his voice was tinged with exhaustion. "The truth is on our side." Hours later, the jury returned. The courtroom was silent as the judge read the verdict. Marcus's heart pounded in his chest, his breath caught in his throat. "On the charge of misconduct in office, we find the defendant, Officer Daniels, guilty." The words hit Marcus like a wave of relief. Carla let out a sob, hugging him tightly as the courtroom erupted into murmurs. Daniels' face was stone, but his eyes burned with fury. The judge banged her gavel. "Order in the court. Sentencing will be scheduled at a later date." Marcus felt a weight lift off his shoulders. Justice had been served, or so he thought. As they left the courthouse, Marcus felt a strange sense of unease. The victory felt fragile, like it could be snatched away at any moment. Reporters swarmed them, shouting questions, but Carter pushed through the crowd, shielding Marcus and Carla. "Let's get to the car," Carter said. "We'll talk once we're somewhere safe." They reached the parking lot, but just as Marcus was about to get into the car, a loud bang echoed through the air. He ducked instinctively, his ears ringing. Carla screamed, and Carter shouted, "Get down." Marcus looked up to see people scattering in panic. A black car sped away from the lot, its tires screeching. On the ground near the courthouse steps, a bullet hole marked the cement. The message was clear. The fight wasn't over. The ringing in Marcus's ears faded, replaced by the chaotic sound of shouting and distant sirens. Carla crouched beside him, gripping his arm tightly. "Are you okay? Did you get hit?" Her voice was panicked, her eyes scanning him for injuries. "I'm fine," Marcus stammered, his heart pounding. His eyes locked on the bullet hole in the cement, and the realization of how close it had come sent a chill down his spine. Carter stood, his face pale but composed. "Let's get out of here," he said, motioning for them to get into the car. No. Back at the hotel, the atmosphere was heavy with fear and frustration. Police officers arrived to take statements, but it felt like a formality. Marcus had seen the look on their faces before, a mix of disinterest and thinly veiled skepticism. After the officers left, Carter paced the room, running a hand through his hair. "This is an escalation. They're not just trying to scare us anymore. They're trying to silence us. What do we do now?" Carla asked, her voice shaking. "We don't let them win," Carter said firmly. "Daniels may have been convicted, but the people protecting him are still out there. We need to expose the entire network." Marcus's head spun. "You mean this isn't over?" "It's over for Daniels," Carter replied. "But the corruption he was part of runs deep. This is bigger than one officer." The next day, the news of the courthouse shooting was everywhere. Reporters speculated about who might have been behind it, but no arrests were made. Marcus felt a mix of anger and helplessness as he watched the coverage. The conviction felt hollow. Yes, Daniels had been found guilty, but the system that allowed him to thrive was still intact. And now Marcus and his family were caught in the crossfire. A week later, the sentencing hearing for Daniels took place. The courtroom was packed, and the tension was thick. Marcus sat beside Carla and Carter, his heart heavy with anticipation. The judge entered, and the room fell silent. Daniels stood at the defense table, his expression unreadable. "Officer Daniels," the judge began, her tone firm, "you have betrayed the trust of the community you swore to serve. Your actions have caused immeasurable harm, not only to the individuals you targeted, but to the integrity of law enforcement as a whole." She paused, her gaze steady. "I hereby sentence you to 15 years in prison." The room buzzed with murmurs. Marcus felt a wave of relief, but also a pang of sadness. 15 years was justice, but it didn't erase the trauma or the lives Daniels had ruined. As Marcus and Carla left the courthouse, they were greeted by reporters again. Carter guided them through the crowd, shielding them from the barrage of questions. "Marcus, how does it feel to see justice served? Do you think this will change anything?" Marcus stopped, surprising both Carla and Carter. He turned to face the cameras, his voice steady. "This isn't just about me. It's about everyone who's been hurt by a system that lets people like Daniels get away with it. This is a step, but it's not the end. We need to do better for everyone." The crowd fell silent for a moment before a flurry of questions erupted. Carter gently pushed Marcus forward, leading him to the car. Months passed, and life began to settle into a new normal. Marcus returned to school, though he was met with mixed reactions. Some students treated him like a hero, while others avoided him, unwilling to associate with someone who had taken on the police. Jaden slowly re-entered Marcus's life, apologizing for his absence during the trial. "I didn't know how to deal with it," Jaden admitted one afternoon as they shot hoops at the park. "But you're the bravest person I know, man. I'm sorry I wasn't there for you." "It's cool," Marcus said, passing him the ball. "Just don't bail on me again." Meanwhile, Carter and Detective Blake continued their fight to expose the corruption within the department. Blake's internal investigation led to the suspension of several officers connected to Daniels, and the community began demanding reforms. Marcus found himself drawn into the movement, speaking at rallies and sharing his story. He realized that his experience, while painful, could be a catalyst for change. He didn't want anyone else to go through what he had endured. One evening, Marcus sat on a couch with Carla, watching the sunset through their apartment window. The light cast a warm glow over the room, and for the first time in months, Marcus felt a sense of peace. "You did good, baby," Carla said, smiling at him. "You stood up for yourself and for what's right. I'm proud of you." Marcus nodded, his heart full. "I couldn't have done it without you." Carla pulled him into a hug, holding him tightly. "No matter what happens, we'll always have each other." Marcus closed his eyes, letting the moment wash over him. The road ahead would be long, but he knew he had the strength to keep walking it. Together, they had faced the storm, and they had survived.